question. So just to say that I think I can confirm David has said that we can record and upload the session, so we will be able to share that with people later, which is great. Reinhard, do you want to read out your question? Yours is quite a long one. Is it a comment actually rather than a question, isn't it, I think?
It's more a comment, but I can put it in a question because David mentioned the Central African Republic, and I have worked there for 7 years until 1999. And I start with a small anecdote there because you have sort of struggling with increasing banditry in the country, especially in the north of the country. And one of the teams of vaccinators got actually stopped by some of the bandits, and these were young men. And they said to the nurses, oh yes, we need an income, so you are working as nurses and we just can't get a job, so we just stop cars and rob them and make our money in this way. So since then I observe in Africa especially, but also in Asia, an increasing amount of banditry, but also linked to religious fundamentalism. So you have Mozambique, Nigeria, Mali, and I could go on. I mean, I also would include Afghanistan with the fall to the Taliban, which are, for me, they are religious fascists. So because I'm a bit like David, I talk about the ugly. So you have this increasing movement. Then you have sort of environmental degradation in many places, quite visible now. And then you have refugees moving quite understandably to safer places. But instead of understanding the problem, you get sort of increasing barriers and nastiness like in the European Union. And then you get a sort of increasing, again, what I call fascist movement against these refugees and against people like in France. Marine Le Pen is likely to be stronger, but not only that, there is somebody right of Marine Le Pen on the right, political right, who is even sort of having chances to become elected. And as you mentioned, David, President or the former President Trump is not dead, but his supporters are quite active. And what I read is that he actually thinks he may have good chances to win the next election. So I feel there is a stream of several very ugly scenarios coming together. And maybe because I'm German and I had a lot of talks with my father about how the fascist movement came about in Germany. And as he said to me, it came like a big wave and you couldn't really understand what was happening, but it was getting worse and worse. And many more people thought that was the only solution to get to address the problems. So I just said, it's not really a question, but you may want to comment on it. And because I think there are quite a few ugly sort of streams coming together at the moment, and they're slowly increasing, and therefore people don't seem to be even getting used to it and seem to normalize what I think is extremely abnormal. Thank you.
David, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, and yeah, no, it's useful. I mean, I realized I was finishing off. I'm usually a fairly optimistic person, and sometimes I'm accused by my colleagues of being too optimistic about the world, but it does depend on what you're looking at. And when I've been looking at extreme poverty over the last 20 years, then the figures have kept going down in a way that was unimaginable. So I have one area of specialization which gives me ground for optimism, but I do find when I think about the way the world was going and the way that COVID-19 hasn't created an opportunity in a way to build back better. We keep getting promised build back better, but it's very hard to spot how it's happening. So yeah, I am pessimistic when I look at this. I think it's got down in what he said and what his question there is, in a way, whilst one needs to be looking at the practical problems, the increased mortality, the children out of school, the lower incomes for some, it's probably in the ideological and particularly often fundamentalist, but also nationalist and populist, that one needs to be looking. And I mean, the great danger of COVID-19 is that nationalist, populist, fundamentalist ideologies often seem to feed very well off fear. And COVID-19, I mean, it's dampened down now, but across the world there was fear. I mean, I was very fortunate. I spent the first 5 weeks of lockdown in New Zealand. And when we were repatriated to the UK, we really felt fearful. We felt COVID-19 was not just bad, but this country was not well governed and things were not under control in a way in which, you know, COVID-19 was killing a few people in New Zealand, but one felt it was being managed well and the science was being listened to. So no, I think there is a real danger that the sort of the fear generated by COVID-19 has helped to fuel these processes. If one was trying to be optimistic, then hopefully when the vaccines, if the vaccines, when they go out, then maybe that will reduce the fear and remove this sort of additional fuel which populist and right-wing and nationalist ideologies have got. If one was looking at that in practical terms, then would have to say, you know, how crazy is the UK government? How crazy is the EU in not getting vaccines into Africa? Because if you were trying to not tackle the disease, if you were trying to tackle fear of the disease, then you would be trying to get Africa vaccinated, because you'd say, and this will just help to calm things down, which makes a much better sort of social base for being able to discuss. Yeah, people can be religious, but it doesn't mean they've got to be fundamentalist and extremist and that. So no, I think this ideological dimension is very important, and that one could imagine rational government. I mean, the problem is certainly when one talks about that, it's very hard in the UK if one could imagine people managing to persuade many people that actually we need to be frightened of an ideology, not of the disease, and we need therefore to ensure that there is greater fairness in vaccinations, because that will reduce the disease in those countries, but it will also reduce some of the ideological processes that might be worrying us. And I'm trying to look for positive messages to come across. And in a way, one is trying to be positive, then it probably is some sort of belief in science and international scientists collaborating and both finding solutions to COVID-19, but also to carbon sequestration and some of the fundamental problems that we don't really know how to deal with climate change at the moment. But you'd have to be fairly optimistic about that. And you'd also have to think about intellectual property sort of regimes and the way that if there is a scientific breakthrough, quite often it's very expensive to get access to it. It's not a global public good, that knowledge, or being able to use it. The final thing I tend to think of is what worries me, certainly when one moves too much into the ugly and the pessimistic, is it can be a very negative, I don't know, set of ideas to create for younger people. It can make that idealism of youth that I can make a difference, I'll do something. In a way, it can disempower that if you give people the feeling that no, there are structural problems and it doesn't matter that you devote your life to making the world a better place. You're not going to make any difference. And so I am seeing a bad scenario coming out. That doesn't mean worse. It just means the world continues as it is rather than improving. But it does worry me that, because potentially it creates sort of disempowering outrage. If you can create outrage which is empowering and gets people to commit themselves, that's one thing. But outrage which might just lead people to feel down and to lose their commitment to the future is worrying. But yeah, Reinhardt's questions unfortunately are appropriate.
yeah, sure. But I think,
I mean, sorry, just to quickly say, I don't want to make people, how shall I say, disempowered, but I feel people are disempowered because we have a sort of discourse which doesn't address the issues. Like, I mean, in Mali and others, they try, or in Afghanistan for 20 years. I mean, I've also been working in Afghanistan, and already in 2001, I predicted that sort of end well if you support warlords in order to introduce democracy and women's rights. So I feel there is this sort of discourse that yeah, we can address these issues in a sort of small piecemeal way, and that I think disempowers people because it doesn't really address the bigger, larger picture. That's why I sort of try to be pretty drastic. Sorry to sort of.
Oh, thank you very much. So a very, very interesting issue you raised there. I think Harvey, you had, I think, a point of clarification, didn't you? Harvey,
yeah, sorry. Yeah, David, you mentioned the informal sector being, I think, not affected or affected. And what do you mean by that?
Okay, God, I better get my dictionary. No, I mean the informal sector. It's a concept we use a lot when we're looking certainly at Africa and Asia and what we used to call developing countries. In a way, it's the unregistered, not registered in any official sense, usually unregulated activity of all sorts. And when one looks certainly at cities in Africa, then round about 80% of the population is employed in what we'd call the informal economy. It's not registered,
Okay.
it's not paying taxes. Nobody really knows its scale, but I mean, that applies across other things. Health systems tend to be informal. You ask friends and you maybe talk to shamans as well as going to a public health facility. Housing tends to be informal, sort of squatter settlements, low-income settlements that are not supposed to be built, but they are built there and people are living in them, and particularly in poorer countries and in the urban sector in many poorer countries. That's the nature.
Okay, thank you.
And maybe, Harvey, I can give you an example in Leeds. If you go to some of these car wash places, they're extremely dodgy. They're employing people who are kind of, on the margins of society, and they're definitely unregulated, many of those. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Well, that's a good example, I think, for Leeds.
I say that, and the sort of gig economy, and certainly the problem when you've got a large informal sector is when you have a hit like COVID-19, many governments in low-income countries said, we're going to give people a cash handout to help them survive. But you don't have a list of the names or identities of most of these people. And so you end up working with lower middle class or middle class people because they're registered and you can process things to them.
Yeah,
thank you.
That's right. Okay, Ashley, I think you have a question.
Yes, I mean, everything feels extremely gloomy at the moment, so I was just hoping for an ounce of optimism as a result of my question. My question is that in 5-10 years' time, climate change is going to be much more serious than COVID. And how can we make the reaction to that a little bit better or even good? I just wonder, David, whether you're at all optimistic that we might learn something from the COVID pandemic so that we can eventually address climate change a bit better. My son's on the climate change team and preparing to go up to Glasgow. And I think that team is pretty pessimistic at the moment that anything good's going to come out of COP26. But I'd like to just hear a little optimistic statement, if you can.
Well, it's funny. One of the things that Rory Horner and I, when we were looking back in April, May 2020, were looking at as a positive possibility was in a way to get people to recognize that dealing with COVID-19 effectively would require multilateral and global thinking, just like climate change, and that actually many of the biggest problems we face, we can't deal with adequately at the national level. We need to work internationally. That seemed like a possibility then, but they've been kept as separate issues and looked at separately in a way. But certainly if one can get people to recognize that one of the lessons of COVID-19 will be that if you want to tackle global health problems or global environmental problems, then you really do need to think globally and get countries collaborating and trying to work out what they can do together and how they can negotiate that certain things that some countries do won't happen because you're part of a sort of a collective enterprise. But whilst one could hope for that, yeah, in April 2020, it doesn't seem, the two issues seem to be treated as separate issues. The idea that multilateralism, stronger UN agencies, more effective COP meetings, more effective COVAX would actually allow us to live, well, allow people in higher income countries to live better, but would also create a global environment that is less likely to create the next epidemic or pandemic, which is unlikely to threaten us. But you know, that certainly has proved difficult at the moment. Yeah, no, I'm not. I mean, I mean, the final thing to think is, I've written about it over the years. Politicians emphasize learning from experience, but unfortunately, when you study learning from experience, you find out that not learning from experience often seems to be part of the process, because there are key structural factors, certain corporations, businesses, sectors, parts of the bureaucracy, political factions that don't want something to be learned because it would challenge the power and the status that they have. And yeah, no, I fear that with COVID-19, you know, there's that, it's Winston Churchill it's described to, but there's about 30 different people it's described to, you know, never waste a good crisis to change things. But it looks like we may have wasted this one.
Thank you. You sound as gloomy as I feel.
I think many people do. Sorry, missed a question here, which is from Dougal, my partner. Dougal, do you want to say?
Yes, it's a slightly more historical question. So for the flu after the First World War, what sort of shadows did it cast in the 5 to 10 years afterwards? Would it count as being ugly, bad, or good?
I'd have to, I mean, rethink my history a bit. But unfortunately, there are other things that are only probably weakly linked to Spanish flu, like the Great Depression of 1928 and the stock market collapse there. I mean, you'd have to do that. But obviously, there was a roaring start in the USA and in Europe to a degree in the economy after the Spanish flu. But then, yeah, other things, the Great Depression and the rise of fascism and Hitler, yeah, managing to capture democracy in Germany set us on a difficult course. I mean, the interesting thing to note is that certainly, I mean, although the number of deaths from COVID-19 is clearly seriously underestimated, the estimates I see of Spanish flu are of 50 million deaths due to it. And, you know, I think 10 million, maybe 15 million is where we perhaps are up to if we look at the real figures. If we try to look, rather than what's been reported, at what may have happened, and that, so Spanish flu certainly seems to have, in a way, with a much smaller world population, was probably more dramatic. But no, yeah, the comparison. I'm trying to think. There is a great book which looks at the history of infectious diseases and tries to understand their role in society. So if the name comes back to me, I'll mention it. I read the first chapter and thought I must read this, and then, so somehow, one never gets time to read it. But there is some work, and I suspect, I think I have actually read at least of one book which has already done a COVID-19 Spanish flu comparison, both looking at the diseases, but then saying, and what does it do to economies and societies? But I think it's a really fascinating question. But I suppose the amazing thing, it comes back to that rather negative point that I was making at the end of the previous question, is about learning from experience. And in a way, in the UK, I know, because back in 2004, I was involved in some foresight exercises with the Cabinet Office. And every year at the foresight office exercises the Cabinet does, then they are told that they should expect every 25 to 40 years a new disease of the scale of HIV/AIDS coming. And yet, you know, we were gobsmacked in the UK, despite the fact that every year the Cabinet is told you need to be ready, because, you know, it's a matter of when, it's not if. It will just be whether it's sooner or whether it's later. And Yeah, maybe one of the good things that come out of this is if governments over the next 10 or 20 years in the UK and in other countries can recognize, well, we do need to think about some of these things. But having said that, one could be negative, because every time a crisis occurs, there is this, oh, it's a big surprise. Well, the finance crisis of 2008 wasn't. We get these financial crises quite regularly. The forms of capitalism we have do seem to exceed themselves, and one expects these sorts of credit crunches or financial collapses. Let's hope we can be ready for the next crisis to some degree. I mean, you can't be sure what it is, but if you've got the names of all the people in your country, if you know who appears to be having difficulties in meeting their income, then you can introduce a social protection scheme straight away that can crudely try and help the people who you know will have the deepest problems. So it's possible to do something.
Thank you, David. A question from me, maybe trying to be a bit more positive, be a bit more positive or think positively about this crisis is, are there any countries, particularly poorer countries in your experience, who've handled a COVID crisis well and are building back better, from whom we can learn some lessons? Because I was aware early on that there were some countries, for example, Ghana I heard of, but there might have been other countries too that perhaps you're aware of, from whom we can learn lessons.
There may be in that, and I did at first think there were very interesting patterns coming out, but unfortunately, as we've had these different waves, then some countries such as East Africa appeared at one stage to have escaped. India, back in February, March of this year, there were discussions about how India had escaped and what had India done right, and could it be genetic, could it be environmental, and then the wave got India. So in terms of identifying any country that's done well, it's quite difficult, because those that did well early on have sometimes been clobbered later. If I'm looking for somewhere that was remarkably successful, it would be Vietnam. And I think if one Googles that, where is it? It's a Princeton University. There's a Innovations for Successful Societies group there, and I think they've identified and looked at the case of Vietnam, probably have others, but Vietnam, interestingly, part of the central planning legacy, it appeared to have politicians and leaders who listened to the scientists and listened to the medical people, and who believed, no, this could be quite a serious problem. And so it was able to plan and start to act. And although it's got that, very big land border, a lot of that with China, where the infection was concentrated, it managed its land border. It managed, I think, to encourage people to start using masks, to think about social distancing. And so certainly Vietnam, for an extended period of time, both through sort of effective public management, but also by believing in planning and looking at the data, it's certainly for a lower middle income country did extremely well. I think Senegal is seen in Africa as certainly having managed to, both manage the disease better, but also I think it's managed to negotiate access to vaccinations. So Senegal is seen as a country which I don't know whether it's still low income or lower middle income. It's certainly not, hasn't been doing particularly well economically, but they've been seen as being able to engage reasonably effectively with coronavirus. But I suppose on the other side, if one was negative, then one would look at the initial outbreak in the UK, and then the way that the USA just allowed parts of the USA allowed it to rip across. And I don't know, maybe that gives us grounds for thinking about equality, which is that, interestingly, the high income countries with the best medical resources in the world, they really couldn't contain the disease in the ways that might have been anticipated from them, perhaps because they didn't respect public health and hadn't thought public health enough. And I suppose when I was looking for something really positive, it would be, I think that public health is going to remain on the top of the agenda nowadays, and that I think is progress. Certainly in my own university, I think in Manchester we've neglected public health over the last 20 years and gone high tech and curative, but public health is still foundational. And even when you move into having wealthy societies, you really need to think through your public health system if you want people to be able to to keep healthy even within a privatized system.
Yes, and I think it's very interesting you're saying that, making that point, because it's really struck me how America has struggled because of a lack of a public health system. You know, their whole approach has been so disorganized, it seems to me, you know, state-wise. But even then, you know, it seems there wasn't, you know, there wasn't central registers of people who had been registered, you know, or needed to be registered. So it seemed very chaotic to me, you know, reading reports. So I think that point of having a public health system and really has strengthened, I would have thought, you know, in people's minds in a lot of countries. And those countries who tended to do best in handling it, that often seem to have public health systems, like, I guess, Taiwan and Korea. I think they both have public health systems, as far as I know.
Yeah, no, well, maybe that's the advantage of dialogue. Maybe that's what, when we're looking for something positive, we need to point out that public health has contributed to to a much better management. It's probably protected the economy much more, and therefore maybe public action is to be thought of much more. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much. I'm going to move on to somebody else's question now. Florence, I think. Florence, are you there? Yes.
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Do you like to say your question?
Yeah, so I suppose it what I have to say also ties into public health in another sense, because I think the younger generations are being handed all of this information that you've been discussing, all of this data, and are potentially losing faith in the institutions that are supposed to be supporting them. And I'm just wondering, what kind of advice and support can we give? Like, even because I think mental health as well, like climate grief, climate linked anxiety and depression is going to be another really big issue that's going to face future generations alongside sort of physical health issues. So I'm just wondering if you had anything to say on that.
Well, I suppose the first thing would be to sort of slightly invert what you've said, and said certainly if one looks at climate change and the environmental crisis and the forms of leadership that Greta Thunberg has been able to provide them, you know, maybe it is actually, thank goodness, the younger generations are not waiting for the older generations to take on the responsibilities that we should have taken on 10, 20, 30 years ago, but they are taking action and demanding attention and trying to begin to fit into political systems and change the sorts of decisions and choices that are made. So maybe we should be inspired by the fact that groups of teenagers and youngsters are really engaging with the climate crisis and demanding that it is seen as a crisis and demanding that there is action, and are thinking of ways that they can begin to ensure that the climate crisis is at the head of the agenda all the time. And I suppose, if one's looking for other things, then it would be for them to think about the environmental crisis, the climate crisis, but also to think more broadly across society and think of the need in a way for public action, for public investment, and for sort of, a focus on global development processes that look to produce global public goods, that look to produce technologies which can be utilized by any country without paying for patents, that used to look to improve access to information and data, and that try to spread knowledge. So I think it's probably, don't trust us, move forward yourself, but do recognize that this is going to have to be dealt with by public action at the national level, but also by multilateralism and cooperation at the international level.
Okay, thanks, David.
Did you have an answer for that, Florence? Have you been able to think that one through?
I'm trying. I'm studying development at Leeds, so I'm looking at this kind of stuff. I'm not sure, to be honest. I think, like you say, just making sure that information is accessible to everyone, and putting pressure on the people in power. But I don't have that much faith in them, to be honest.
No, it's difficult to have faith in them, but maybe, I mean, the other thing is probably just think about the scale and the forms of information that we get. And we are in this 24/7 sort of news cycle now where we move from disaster to disaster. The thing I think probably academics find more difficult and less exciting maybe to work on are just the sort of very routine day-to-day processes that seem to make life better. And I suppose when I think about why I've been more optimistic in the second half of my career than the first half of my career, it's partly because extreme poverty did begin to reduce. I found it much harder to find malnourished children in Africa and Asia in my early career. Then you only had to walk out the door and you could find the problem. Now, not the problem, it's still there, but it's much more difficult at a lower scale. And often that's not necessarily through a good leader or good governance. It's simply by education gently improving, some girls getting educated, people talking to each other about washing their hands, about whether it's worth investing in a low-cost toilet and just a set of other very basic things, learning to do double entry bookkeeping on a very simple scale so they can run a business and maybe get it right for themselves. And that. So I think there are also a whole set of very gentle processes that most people are involved in, which can just lead to economic and social improvements. But it's difficult to ignore the big headlines, which are often about bad leadership, about disasters, about fairly nasty political events. But it would be just looking across most of humanity who like to collaborate and get on with their neighbors and in a way just gently help each other. And so the progress is very slow and sort of incredibly incremental, but still, things move along. And certainly if I look somewhere like Bangladesh, that's been the case. Bangladesh has been very badly governed, venal leaders. It's got a private sector that's grown a lot, but it's very venal, very corrupt. But, life expectancy in Bangladesh, quite often it's been recorded as increasing by a year during the course of a year. And, there's been a flood, there's been corruption in government. Yeah, the defense forces had weapons bought for it, which have cost $1 billion and don't do anything, but still somehow just the day-to-day processes of economic and social life, incredibly imperfect, have just been edging things forward. So yeah, maybe it is to also just give a bit of attention to those very gentle processes and recognizing that micro level positive things are happening. And yeah, it's a pity when we get human induced disasters or environmental disasters, but these gentle processes can and appear to be able to go on.
Yeah, interesting point. Yeah, I got a question from Christina Walsh. Walsh, is she around? Christina?
Yes. Yeah.
Hi.
Well, it's a bit of a little bit on the side, but will Brexit slow down our recovery from COVID? And I'm saying, for example, our labour shortage, because 100,000 lorry drivers short is an absolute disaster for this country. And when we've got people trying to get jobs, and it's the difficulty of getting stuck at borders that's putting people off coming as lorry drivers. I don't know how we're going to recover without giving very high wages, and that will cause inflation. And just don't know whether we can handle it, really.
Yeah, well, I'd read the papers, but I wouldn't in any way claim to be to have any specialized knowledge on this. But yeah, I mean, like 93% of academics in the UK, I was anti-Brexit. So we don't sort of understand. And, one of the reasons the Conservative government hates academics and universities is not because they think we're a waste of time, but also they see us as the enemy in many ways, perhaps. But I think Brexit certainly will slow down our recovery from COVID, and the labour shortage particularly will knock on. And I mean, I've been listening to the Conservative conference the last couple of days in which they say, no, there's a global shortage of drivers, there's a European shortage of drivers, and Germany's short of them, which is not a lie, but actually, you know, Germany and China and the world are not facing closed petrol stations and empty supermarket shelves, despite the fact people have got the money to buy these products, despite the fact the products are very close and available. So something different is happening in the UK, and certainly Brexit would appear to be part of that problem. Whether it will slow recovery from COVID-19 down longer, I think it's quite likely to, certainly because if one looks at something like our aid policy, we've reduced aid spending, we're linking it more to our military and commercial interests. That probably means we're not going to use British aid effectively to help reduce infections in Africa and reduce the likelihood of another mutant or another variant that will lead to another wave of deaths and another need for rapid vaccine development and perhaps lockdowns. So, I think not being a stronger part of the multilateral system as we used to be is weakening. Aligning with the USA rather than aligning with Europe, I don't know, you'd have to look at it, but the EU was potentially an additional global power that could talk to the USA and talk to China. With the UK gone, that weakens it. But with us not really being able to get on well with the Americans, or particularly get close to them, then we are floating with that. And I'm not sure at all. I mean, the 60 deals that we've had, the 60 trade deals that Liz Truss has negotiated, well, they're all rolled over. And if you think that you can replace the EU with Canada and Australia, you haven't noticed that Canada's 2,500 miles away, the close parts, and 5,000 miles away, and Australia's about 10,000 miles away. And that does make a difference to your economic relationship, whether you're looking at tourism, whether you're looking at agricultural products or industrial products. So, I can't see Brexit helping on it, but maybe I'm the wrong person to answer that question.
Okay, I think now Jeff Tansey would like to make a verbal contribution. So, Jeff, are you there?
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks, David. I just wanted to reflect on a couple of things. There is the other side of global development, because we focused on the poor, but what's happened is the rich have got very much richer, and especially post the crash when you've had asset inflation. Also, we've created a whole set of private oligopolies that are actually running so many sectors in the world. And you mentioned, and I think this is a point that's too often missed, the importance of the global intellectual property regime, making it more and more difficult to share the knowledge that we need to overcome the challenges in climate or in dealing with pandemics and so forth. I think the other element of this is part of a much bigger rethink we need of the meaning of security, because I think there is a danger of increased tensions. We're going back to kind of great power thinking version 2 for the 21st century. And the challenge is to help to redirect a lot of the resources and talent that goes into military approaches to security, to dealing with the kind of things you're talking about, David. So, I mean, I know I'm working with Paul Rogers and a few others on if we can organise some scenarios that start to look at this. So I think that is, the bigger framing in what we're seeing that's going on. But I think also the optimistic bit, and yet I can see it in a lot of the food movements that I'm involved with, there are so many people in so many places throughout the world who are really active and get it, that the way the world's run isn't fit for purpose for the 21st century. They don't have power, mostly, but that is a possible, that is one of the optimistic elements. And that if people can recognise they have multiple identities, none of us are a single identity with this religion or that or the other. I think those are the kind of mixture of things that come in. I'll stick up a link to a talk by Paul Rogers, which has a little bit of positiveness at the end, if you want to have a look at that some as well. And I'd like to follow up with you, David, about some scenario work that we're working on subsequently.
Okay, great.
Please get into like that, and it'd be great to see what Paul's up to, because it's always great to hear what Paul's thinking and work with him. I haven't seen him for 4 or 5 years, but yeah, it'd be great.
Well, he's just published the 4th edition of his book Losing Control, and he and I are writing a new preface for a book that we edited and published in 1993 that was republished this year, called A World Divided: Militarism and Development After the Cold War. So yeah, I'll get in touch with you and I'll put you into up to date. Cheers.
Great. Thanks very much, Jeff. And just to mention, not everybody's here, but Jeff is going to be our speaker in December. Nicola, do you want to, you have a question?
Yeah. So I work with a small global development charity in Uganda, and I'm a very optimistic person. I'm going to put that out on the table. I like to be optimistic. I like to think, you know, like you said, David, I've seen a lot of positivity. I've been working there for the last 13 years. I've seen a lot of positive change in that time, of people managing to come out of poverty, of young people getting into education, which was great. But COVID has kind of created this perfect storm now for the charity sector. And people working in global development, because you've got more need. Like, you know, in Uganda right now, there is so many more people in poverty than there were before. And a lot of these people aren't documented, like you said. I mean, we're working with homeless young people and their families. So a lot of them kind of slip through the cracks. And then you're in a world where there's fewer funds available, and a lot of funds. So I'm part of networks where, you know, you hear day on day, oh, this fund that used to give for global development is now like not going to give for global development anymore. UK aid, we were due to get a grant in July this year, our first UK aid grant. Then it was pulled as part of the UK aid cuts, which after having done over 200 hours of work, doing all the paperwork for it, I was, as you can understand, not best pleased about that. So yeah, like what's going to come next? In, you know, as we remain optimistic, as people are trying their best to try and take forward all that learning that has been done and all that positivity that has happened, but now we're in a world where the need has risen sharply again. What's going to come next, if you can predict the future?
Yeah, I don't know if I can predict the future, but certainly, I don't know, actually being in a British university and a unit that specialises in sort of global development, used to be international development, then the environment has changed dramatically the last few years. And one had, in a way, public support and government support, but that has eroded on it. Well, what's going to come next? I'm not sure I can predict that. One would have to hope that there may be a bounce back from the great British public, and that actually they may begin to maybe not replace you know, UK aid, but certainly recognize that, you know, my goodness, there is incredible suffering, and that, yeah, I'm in an incredibly affluent position, so I could contribute a little bit more, and certainly seeing if one could, yeah, broaden the base in that way, may be a way forward. Whether, I mean, as happened, I mean, the way with the Thatcher government was hitting edge, whether after this present sort of, thumping the charitable sector and reducing it grants, whether there'll suddenly be a growing recognition, oh my goodness, we need this in Afghanistan, we need this in Somalia. You know, the soldiers cannot possibly do what we want. We need the humanitarian work, but we also need the civil society building stuff, and there's no way that the military can do that. It's people sitting down talking for years, doing basic services, which gets people to sort of focus and develop those relationships. So one might hope that that the present government or whatever follows it realizes, no, we do actually need a third sector to be supporting us in these very difficult to operate contexts in that way. I suppose the thing that, I mean, I'd take strength from is actually, it's something which, it's funny, I'm finding doing some work with schools at the moment on COP26, which puts you in a very top-down sort of UN thinking, national thinking process. But it is still to recognize that when you're looking at most of the activity, often the voluntary activity, the contributions of time, labor, sometimes money, that help poor people, then it actually comes from other poor people and near poor people that they live with. And hopefully those processes will continue, and that will be a a form of protection that will continue. Whether that can strengthen them, I don't know. But certainly, you know, we need to do more. But there's also this tendency for us to think that we're more important than maybe players at the very local level, whose religions sometimes, spirituality, moral motivations, political ideologies leave them to think, yeah, I may have bugger all, but I could help my neighbor, and they do it. So, and I suppose surviving these aid budget reductions, but being in a position to effectively scale up when hopefully, I mean, sanity returns is perhaps too much. But I'm still interested to look at it. It's interesting the way that tying Brexit and the nationalism behind that, in a way, allowed the withdrawal from the 0.7%. I mean, it's still down as temporary. There hasn't been an attempt by the Conservatives as yet to push it through and remove 0.7% and drive down to just leave it open or whatever else. It'll be interesting to see whether the British public do bounce back, because clearly over the last 20 years, then public support for aid and for the idea of helping non-citizens who've got big problems outside of the country has been a strength of British civil society. Whether that can bounce back, or whether this nationalist thrust, this Brexit thrust, this anti-foreigner, anti-migrant thrust will actually manage to fuel those sentiments. But it takes it back to the point we were making early on. One's got to think practically, but it also is thinking of how one can add to the ideology and how one can undermine the nationalist arguments and undermine this belief that, no, we'll be best if we're an island floating in the sea, disconnected from the rest of the world. Well, no, if you want poverty, if you want social and economic and political problems, you just try floating the UK off and see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. I mean, it's hard to know what will happen, isn't it? I did wonder actually myself, you know, given the Afghanistan crisis and the fact that, you know, a lot of people in sort of middle England know somebody who's in the military in Afghanistan. And so that kind of, to me, when the crisis was going on, sort of was a positive thing, because it was, you know, they were actually interested in how they could support people from Afghanistan. So I thought that did show a positive side, but whether that would transfer to other groups as well, I don't know. I mean, this is just because they knew people who worked in Afghanistan. But
so if one does get down to that detail, because I mean, yeah, Britain would be strong in that our middle classes and even our elites are in the military and are exposed in Afghanistan. Whereas in the USA, it's the underclass who are the soldiers who get sent.
Yes, that's right.
Who get sent to Afghanistan. And in a way, you know, anybody who's middle class or in the elite, your kids don't get involved with the military, or if they do, then they're in the Pentagon. They're nowhere near that frontline stuff. That is purely for the underclasses and for those who haven't got better opportunities. So yeah, we have an opportunity there.
Yes, I don't think this is a question. I think it's Simeon Perry is talking. I think there's in the chat. There's a sort of comment for you, Nicola. I don't know whether Simeon, you want to say anything, or you have a question or anything. You're muted, by the way.
Sorry. Famous last thing of virtual meetings. No, it's just a comment, not a question. Just picking up on the Africa scene and what Reinhardt said earlier.
Right.
Nothing more to add.
Okay, thank you.
But if I could just comment on that, I think it's a dilemma for all of us, particularly for our academics at the moment. There was an era of Afro-pessimism when all analysis and teaching on Africa seemed to make Africa feel different. And then when growth occurred in Africa, when poverty began to reduce, when in a way it began to come out of the mortality effects of age to a degree, and the anti-malarial bed nets began to improve life expectancy, there was in a way that Afro-pessimism drop. But certainly the problem at the moment that one has, particularly when one looks at that sort of diagram of access to vaccinations, is Africa somehow being treated as different Because the problem when Africa is seen as different is, it becomes easier for people to think, oh, that's because of those Africans and their cultures and their religions, and the danger that sort of recognizing this differential position of Africa in a way can almost fuel racism against Africa and Africans. I think that's a real dilemma. When one looks at the data on Africa, you can't be optimistic, but one doesn't need an era of Afro-pessimism to occur again.
Is there anybody else who'd like to ask a question who hasn't asked one already? Anybody around who'd like to sort of say anything, comment or ask a question? I think there's, pardon? Wait a minute, there's, no, I think those are just kind of comments and links. Yeah, Reinhard has put a link in there about successful completion of vaccinations in Bhutan, which is positive. Yes, it is a very small country, of course, but it is very positive that they've done that. And Jeff has given a link for some positive thinking as well at the end. So thank you very much for that. Yeah. So I think if there are no more questions, then I think maybe we'll draw this to a close. David, thank you very much. I think it's been a very interesting, wide-ranging discussion, and it's been very thought-provoking. I'm not sure we've come out with too much positive thinking, but there's been hope. There's been rays in there, haven't there? Little snippets that have, give you positive thoughts, hope, well, some hope for the future. So I think we have to stay positive in this and work together as much as we can to move things forward. So thank you very much anyway for contributing and for your references, and also for allowing us to record. That's great. Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for